For centuries, we have been told a story about the Trojan War, a grand, tragic, romantic epic. A beautiful queen, Helen of Sparta, stolen away by the Prince of Troy. 1,000 Greek ships launching to bring her back. 10 years of bloodshed, duels, and gods meddling in human affairs. And at the end, a famous Trojan horse, a clever ruse that brought the mighty city of Troy to its knees. It's a story that has survived for over 3,000 years, passed down through Homer's Iliad and countless retellings. But here's the problem. What if that story isn't true? What if the war wasn't about love at all, but about something far more ruthless control over trade, gold, and power? The more you look into the evidence, the more the love story looks like a cover, a poetic smokescreen hiding a brutal political and economic conflict. And if the Trojan horse really existed, it may not have been a romantic wooden gift, but one of the most devastating military deceptions in history. Let's start with Helen. In the popular version, she's the face that launched 1,000 ships. Her abduction or elopement, depending on who you ask, was the spark that lit the war. But there is a problem. Ancient records outside of Homer's Zeus barely mention Helen at all. The Hittite archives, which actually reference a conflict in western Anatolia around the same time, describe disputes over a territory called Wailusa believed to be Troy, not over a woman, but over political alliances and trade agreements. In other words, this may not have been a war of passion, but a war of profit. Troy's location was its greatest weapon. Sitting near the Dardanelles Strait, it controlled one of the most important trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Whoever controlled Troy could tax, regulate, or block goods moving through, grain, metals, luxury goods, all the lifeblood of ancient economies. This was not a small border dispute. It was about economic chokehold over the region. So why would the Greeks risk 10 years of war? Not to rescue one woman, but to break Troy's grip on this trade and secure their dominance. And the idea that the war lasted exactly 10 years conveniently rounded already feels like mythology rather than history. Wars in the ancient world didn't follow neat timelines. They were messy, drawn out, interrupted by seasons and politics. A decade-long siege makes for a great epic, but historians suspect the conflict may have been shorter or fought in multiple campaigns over several years. Now, let's talk about the gods. In Homer's telling, the Olympian gods took sides, turning the war into a cosmic drama. While that makes for gripping poetry, it also serves another purpose. It shifts the focus away from human greed and ambition. Blame Zeus or Aphrodite for starting the war, and you conveniently ignore the economic motivations of kings and generals. And then we reach the most famous image, the Trojan horse. Every child who hears the story imagines a giant wooden horse rolled into Troy, packed with Greek soldiers. It's a striking visual, but when you strip away the legend, you have to ask, would an entire city of experienced warriors really be so foolish as to drag an enemy gift inside their gates without suspicion? Archaeologists and military historians have suggested alternatives. The horse may have been a siege engine, a massive battering ram, or tower nicknamed Horse, because of its design or symbolic association with the god Poseidon, who was linked to horses in earthquakes. Others believe it was a metaphor, perhaps referring to a naval vessel, or even a natural disaster, like an earthquake that breached Troy's walls. And here's the intriguing part. The destruction layer found at the archaeological site of Hezarlik, widely believed to be ancient Troy, shows signs of burning and collapse, but also seismic activity. Could the horse in the story be poetic shorthand for an earthquake that the Greeks exploited to enter the city? If that's true, then the story of the wooden horse might be less about cleverness and more about timing using a natural disaster to mask a military invasion. But myths have power because they simplify. They turn complex geopolitical events into digestible narratives. A love story is easier to remember than a dispute over grain tariffs. A giant horse is more cinematic than a siege tower. And a war blessed or cursed by gods makes for a better tale than one driven by cold-blooded economics. Still, you have to wonder who shaped the myth. Was it Homer himself, preserving fragments of oral tradition while adding dramatic flourishes? Or was the myth deliberately crafted to hide the real motives? In the ancient world, controlling the narrative was as powerful as winning the war itself. The Greeks could portray themselves as avengers of an insult, rather than aggressors hungry for Troy's wealth and strategic location. And Troy, in defeat, could blame the trickery of the gods, rather than admit to being outmaneuvered by human cunning. But let's not forget history is written by the victors. The surviving version of the Trojan War comes almost entirely from the Greek perspective. We have little to no written record from the Trojans themselves. Imagine if the only account of a modern war came from one side's propaganda. How much truth would survive? Even the archaeological evidence is debated. The layers of destruction at Hisarlik suggest the city was rebuilt multiple times, meaning there may have been several Trojan Wars over the centuries. The one immortalized in the Iliad could be a merging of different conflicts, condensed into a single dramatic narrative. And that makes the myth even more interesting. If it's a blend of fact and fiction, then every element from Helen to the horse could be symbolic, a kind of ancient coded message about real events. For example, Helen might not be a person at all, but a stand-in for a valuable commodity or political alliance that sparked the war. The horse could be a metaphor for a tactical advantage. The gods could represent the unpredictable forces, weather, politics, disease, that shape the outcome of war. The problem is, over time, people stopped seeing these as metaphors and started treating them as literal history. And once a story becomes history, it's incredibly hard to challenge. Think about it. If you told someone that the Trojan War wasn't about Helen, they might dismiss you as overcomplicating a simple story. But the truth is, simple stories are often the ones most carefully designed to hide the messy reality underneath. The beauty of the Trojan War myth is that it works on both levels. It entertains and inspires, while quietly preserving the skeleton of a real conflict whose true causes have been obscured for millennia. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes. The war's untold truth is far more human and far more ruthless than the romantic legend we've been fed. The deeper you dig into the Trojan War, the more it stops looking like a single, clear-cut story and starts to resemble a tapestry of overlapping conflicts, political agendas, and deliberate myth-making. The romantic version, with its neat cause and effect chain, works perfectly for poetry and drama. But if you look at it through the lens of logistics, economics, and human ambition, the cracks in that version appear almost immediately. Imagine the reality of a siege that supposedly lasted 10 years. We read talking about thousands of men from multiple Greek kingdoms living away from home for an entire decade, maintaining supplies, weapons, morale, and cohesion. It is not just unlikely, it is nearly impossible without a highly organized network of allies and controlled territories to keep the army fed and equipped. Ancient warfare wasn't like in the movies. It depended heavily on harvest seasons, local resources, and constant negotiations with neighboring powers. This tells us one thing. If the Greeks really sustained such a long campaign, they weren't acting on impulse or a single insult. They were executing a strategic plan that involved political coordination on a scale rarely seen in that era. That plan likely revolved around Troy's location, a prize so valuable it could justify the enormous cost of war. Troy sat at a choke point for trade between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Grain, metals, luxury goods, everything that flowed between these regions passed through Troy's influence. If the Greeks could take control, they wouldn't just humiliate a rival. They would own one of the most important economic gateways in the ancient world. That's worth far more than the return of one woman, no matter how beautiful she was said to be. And yet, when the war is told to us, that political reality is buried beneath the surface of a love story. Why? Because love and honor are easier to rally people around than tariffs and trade monopolies. The Trojan horse itself is a perfect example of this mythologizing process. We're told the Greeks built an enormous wooden horse, hollowed out the inside, and filled it with soldiers who waited until nightfall to strike. It's the ultimate trick, clever, theatrical, and unforgettable. But historians and archaeologists point out a serious problem. Would any competent city defense really accept such a bizarre gift from the enemy they had been fighting for years? It's like leaving your gates wide open for disaster. The more plausible theories suggest the horse was either a siege machine, a naval vessel, or even a poetic metaphor for an earthquake that damaged Troy's defenses. The horse was associated with Poseidon, god of earthquakes and the sea, and in ancient languages, metaphors like this were common. A battering ram or siege tower could be described as a horse if it had a certain shape. Over generations of retelling, the metaphor might have been taken literally, transforming practical siegecraft into the legendary ruse we all know today. There's also the theory of betrayal from within. A prolonged siege can fracture a city politically. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion can turn citizens against each other. If a faction within Troy believed they could benefit from Greek victory or simply wanted to end the suffering, they might have opened the gates at a critical moment. In this version, the horse could symbolize those traitors, a gift from within rather than from outside. It's a darker but far more human explanation. And this leads us to an important truth. History favors explanations that are easy to remember, emotionally powerful, and politically useful. The story of the Trojan War that survived was shaped by those who had the most to gain from telling it a certain way. Homer's Iliad may have preserved real events, but it also dressed them in layers of symbolism and entertainment. The gods' involvement, for example, serves multiple purposes. It adds grandeur, makes the war seem fated, and takes the blame away from human greed. If Zeus wanted the war, then no one has to admit it was really about money. If Aphrodite promised Helen to Paris, then no one has to mention grain routes and tax control. The gods turn a calculated geopolitical conflict into a divine soap opera. The absence of Troy's own records is critical here. We don't know how they saw the war. To them, the Greeks might have been nothing more than opportunistic invaders using a pretext to mask a land grab. Without their side of the story, the Greek version stands unchallenged. And over time, repeated enough, it becomes truth. This is the danger of ancient history. Without multiple perspectives, myth and propaganda can become indistinguishable from fact. Archaeology helps, but only in fragments. The site at Hizarlik shows multiple layers of destruction, suggesting that the Trojan War might be a merging of several conflicts over centuries. Fires, earthquakes, and battles all leave similar traces in the earth, making it difficult to assign a single cause to any one layer. It's entirely possible that there was no singular war, but rather a series of struggles, later woven into one dramatic epic. The Greeks' control over the narrative allowed them to frame themselves as clever, brave, and righteous, while the Trojans became the naive victims of a spectacular trick. In reality, the war might have been far more brutal, pragmatic, and morally gray than the polished legend suggests. And that's the point. Myth doesn't have to be a lie to distort the truth. It only needs to choose which truths to leave out. If the Trojan War teaches us anything, it asks that the way a story is told can be just as powerful as the events themselves. When we accept the neat version, Helen's beauty, a stolen queen, our heroic rescue, we accept the moral framework it offers. The Greeks are cast as the righteous avengers, the Trojans as the deceived victims. But strip away the romance, and you find something far less flattering: the possibility that the Greeks were aggressors in a calculated campaign for economic dominance. And if that's true, then the Trojan horse is not a clever emblem of justice, but a lasting symbol of ruthless ambition. The most dangerous part of the myth is not that it misrepresents the cause, but that it disguises the nature of power. Wars have always been fought for resources, control, and political advantage, yet they are often sold to the public as battles for honor, justice, or divine destiny. The Trojan War may be one of the earliest and most enduring examples of that pattern. Consider how the story changes when told from the other side. What if the Trojans saw the war as an unprovoked invasion? What if Paris was not a reckless kidnapper, but a political scapegoat? What if Helen was never in Troy at all, and her supposed presence there was nothing more than a convenient excuse to mobilize the Greek alliance? Without Trojan records, we can't confirm or refute any of this. And that absence is no accident. Victors throughout history have erased or overwritten the stories of the defeated. The result is what we have today, a single narrative, polished and repeated until it feels like unquestionable truth. The archaeological record offers only pieces. Layers of destruction at Troy show evidence of fire, siege damage, and even earthquakes. Which of these events belongs to the war, and which to unrelated conflicts, we may never know. But what is clear is that the destruction wasn't unique. Troy was attacked and rebuilt multiple times, which means the war in Homer's epics might actually be an amalgamation of centuries of conflict condensed into one epic tale. And if that's the case, then the Trojan Horse, Helen, and the gods themselves are literary devices, not historical certainties. Even the horse, whether a siege machine, a metaphor for betrayal, or a poetic name for an earthquake, works better as a symbol than as a fact. That's the genius of myth. It can carry multiple meanings at once, allowing every retelling to emphasize the lesson that benefits its teller. The Greeks could celebrate cunning over brute force. The Romans could claim noble ancestry by tracing their origins to Trojan survivors. Later civilizations could mine the story from moral lessons about loyalty, pride, and fate. In each case, the truth of what actually happened mattered less than the usefulness of the story. This should make us uncomfortable because it forces us to confront how much of our own history might be shaped in the same way. If one of the most famous wars in human memory can be reframed, romanticized, and weaponized over millennia, what does that say about events only a few decades old? How much of what we accept as historical fact is simply the version told by those who had the power to tell it? This is why the Trojan War still matters. It is not just an ancient legend, it's a mirror held up to the mechanics of power, showing us that narratives are as much a battlefield as the walls of any city. Whoever controls the story controls how future generations understand the past, and by extension, how they see the present. And that control can be as decisive as any army or weapon. So was the Trojan War fought for love, for revenge? Or was it fought for something colder and more calculating: control over trade, the dismantling of a rival's economy, and the reshaping of the political map? The truth might be lost forever beneath the layers of myth, propaganda, and time. But that doesn't mean we should stop asking. On the contrary, it means we should question more. Because behind every romanticized legend is a version of events that someone at some point didn't want us to see. And maybe the real lesson of the Trojan War isn't about bravery, loyalty, or even cleverness. It's about the danger of letting one story, told by one side, become the only story that survives. The city burned, the victors sailed home, and the defeated vanished into the shadows of history. But the battle for the truth? That war never ended. And as long as we keep telling the story without asking who benefits from the way it is told, we're still living under the shadow of that wooden horse, still opening our gates to a narrative that may not be what it seems.